Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Fireside chat today with Victoria Ibezim-Ohaeri, Executive Director at Spaces for Change, which is a non-profit organization working to infuse human rights into social and economic governance processes based in Nigeria. For those of you who don't know or we've not met, my name is Shirish Pathak. I represent Fintelekt, and I'm delighted to be your host today. As many of you already know, at Fintelekt, our main focus is on training and capacity building across the AML CFT ecosystem. We believe that the work we do helps to strengthen compliance across banks, financial institutions, regulators, governments, and law enforcement agencies across the globe, enabling them to operate more effectively and in a balanced manner. And today's session is one such example of our work where we try to bring in a different perspective on AML CFT for the benefit of the fintech compliance community. Of course, if you need detailed training customized to your organization's needs, please do reach out to us separately and we'll be happy to assist. But the theme of the session today is the hidden cost of AML, a contrarian view for the compliance community. And I'm delighted that Victoria has agreed to share her thoughts on this subject. I had the good fortune of meeting Victoria recently at the FATF Private Sector Collaboration Forum. And when we met, we decided to schedule this session whenever time permitted. So, Victoria, welcome to this chat today. And at the outset, can you tell our viewers a bit about yourself and also about the work that you do at Spaces for Change?
Thank you, Shirish. Good morning, listeners. I'm joining from Lagos, Nigeria. My name is Victoria Ibezim-Ohaeri. I am the founder and also the Director of Research and Policy at Spaces for Change, which is a nonprofit organization working across West Africa, but we're headquartered in Nigeria. We conduct research and also advocacy, focusing on strategic sectors such as urban governance, gender, security, and defending the civic space. So on our security work, which is what I'm going to talk about today, we are basically involved in conducting researches and policy analysis that have helped to deepen understanding of how counterterrorism and other global security measures, how they impact human rights and civil society in general. And we take action to see how we can mitigate those impacts. Hello, Shirish.
Sorry, I was on mute. My apologies.
Okay,
Can you hear me now? All right. So, Victoria, there have been cases in the past where, NGOs or journalists or even activists have faced challenges because of AML safety regulations. Can you share any particular examples of any such instances that you may have seen?
So I think we can start with the most recent example that happened with a nonprofit, Palestinian Action, that have been designated a terrorist organization. And what was the offense? For conducting protests on the happenings in their country. They are not the only organizations that have protested. So, in fact, many countries have been protests across countries where people are equally very, very appalled and outraged by what is going on in Palestine. But what we have seen is a terrorist designation. I know what that means. It means that your assets will be frozen. It means that you are practically a global criminal. Your accounts will be frozen. You cannot transfer funds. You cannot pay your staff. You cannot operate legally. You cannot travel safely. You cannot do anything any normal human being can do. And what is the offense? Not because you engage in any criminal activity, not because you bombed any building, not because you killed anybody, not because you posed any threat, just because you are carrying out your normal advocacy or humanitarian activities. This is just a global example that anyone from any part of the world can relate with, but I'll be happy to share some specific happenings within the West African context.
Right. So, Victoria, would you say that this problem that you just described, is it more pronounced in developing countries, maybe because of weaker democratic institutions or because of limited regulatory oversight?
I wouldn't say it is. I think it's something that applies mainly to regions that are subject to sanctions and counterterrorism measures. And those regions are everywhere across the world. You're still seeing like in Europe, in the MENA region, in Africa, in Asia and Pacific. There are many contexts that are subject to those sanction regimes. So you see those measures are heightened, and they call them higher risk jurisdictions. And once you're classified in higher risk jurisdiction, it comes with certain measures, certain impacts, certain implications for both the local economy and the ability to interact with other countries across the world.
Right. So, we met at the FATF Collaborative Forum, and, FATF has been acknowledging the unintended consequences of AML CFT standards, especially on financial inclusion and on civil society. But do you believe that the FATF understanding reflects the actual realities on the ground? And, what would be your recommendations to FATF?
Yeah, I think there have been steps taken by FATF, very positive steps or strong steps taken by FATF to address some of the concerns, especially those raised by the nonprofit community about the unintended consequences or misuse of the CT architecture, the counterterrorism and countering financing of terrorism architecture to curtail civic freedoms. One of the things FATF did, they conducted they set up the work stream on unintended consequences work stream and tried to gather evidence from all over the world. And it was revealing for them, and that was what informed the revision of Recommendation 8 in 2023. But before then, certain things have happened that have made the efforts of FATF not to, for us, we are not seeing a lot of the progress at the national levels. And what are some of those things? The first is the original language of Recommendation 8 that nonprofit organizations are particularly vulnerable to terrorism financing abuse. Even though FATF has taken steps in 2016, 2023 to revise that language of for Recommendation 8, the sentiment has traveled widely across the world, and that sentiment has informed the development of hard law in many national contexts. And while it is easy for FATF at the upstream level to conduct periodic reviews of their frameworks, those upstream reviews defy graffiti. They are not occurring automatically and uniformly at the domestic level. What are the reasons? Some countries require the supermajority rule to be able to reform their laws. What that means that sometimes you need to get the parliament to agree to a two-third majority vote on a particular provision before amendment can take place, and that is expensive and that takes a lot of time. So sometimes countries just leave that alone, even if they agree in principle that this is hurting the sector, but do nothing again. And once it's in the hard law, it is what the judges will enforce. It is what law enforcement will go with. So that hasn't changed. Another one is supervisor knowledge varies. And when I say supervisor knowledge, it doesn't mean that supervisors, whether in the banks and law enforcement, it doesn't mean that they didn't go to school. It's just that these commitments come with national obligations. For instance, when the United Nations will roll out a resolution or a special resolution, look at 264 resolution, for instance, or that will require countries to abide by certain humanitarian exemptions. It means that countries need to also apply international humanitarian law, they need to apply human rights law in their counterterrorism operations. How many bankers understand what IHL mean? How many of them understand international law? How many of them understand even what a country's domestic obligation under international law? They are just bankers. They're in the business of, transacting with money, making sure transfers move from one point to the other. So these things have continued to happen, and also not a lot of knowledge a lot of capacity also at the point of policy implementers, those who transport, tries to transplant international norms to local frameworks. The transplantation is not happening the way it should. So people are coming with their own understanding of what should work and what should not work. And I think the last part is the very technical nature of the entire CFT architecture. When you say a risk-based approach, when you say countries should identify, assess, understand the risk, the money laundering and terrorism financing risks that they are facing, and then apply proportionate measures to mitigate the risk. What does that mean? It's actually discretionary instruction, because people will understand it differently. People will apply, even within the same financial sector. From bank to bank, the understanding of risk-based approach will differ. And it also differs from compliance specialist to compliance specialist. So these are some of the factors that have made it very difficult for some of the positive developments at the global level to trickle down to the national levels.
Right. Thanks, Victoria. Okay, before I get on to the next question, let me just request the audience, if you have any questions for Victoria, please post them in the Q&A window, and we will take them up once we have finished our chat. So moving back to you, Victoria, and thinking of it from the other side, from banks and financial institutions and all the reporting entities. We've seen that many reporting entities, out of fear of regulatory penalties or reputational damage, often over-comply with AML CFT rules, right? In your experience, how serious is this problem? How much does it impact the NGO sector, the other sectors that you spoke about, and what can be done to address it?
Yeah, so we understand the concern of banks, and that is why we are still talking about financial inclusion. And why that has persisted is because banks, once you've already classified an area as a high-risk jurisdiction subject to certain sanctions. Banks interpret that as a warning. And for them, they read desist warning. And what most of them do in such context is to avoid a transaction. And when they decide to avoid the transaction, instead of managing the risk, it results in de-risking. So they avoid certain customers and leave them out of the banking sector. And that translates to denial to essential banking services. That again, and why are they doing that? Because they are afraid of penalties, they're afraid of being subject to certain sanctions, license revocations. The penalties for the banking financial institutions are very huge. So you would understand why they are taking this. And again, the technicalities of risk. What is high risk? What is risk-based approach? And how do they even segregate? We have had lots of conversation with the financial institutions in Nigeria. And one of the things we demanded was for them to apply simplified measures to nonprofit organizations. And our basis for that was that the country has conducted a risk assessment of the nonprofit organization sector and have concluded the assessment found that most organizations are low risk. So if most organizations are low risk to TF, it means that banks should apply. But there are certain subsets, because that is what the assessment requires, identifying the subset of NPOs that are particularly vulnerable so that measures would be targeted at those subsets. For the bankers, they say they don't know how to distinguish between those subsets, the high risk and a low risk subset, because they're not going to ask a customer, are you high risk? Are you low risk? It's hard for them. So for them, a nonprofit is a nonprofit. So the segregation, it is us in the nonprofit community that understand that segregation. So a banker does not understand the difference between a humanitarian organization and an advocacy organization. And they are trying to explain to them, we just do advocacy, we are challenging governance challenges, we're trying to hold government accountable, we are not involved in delivering humanitarian services to sanction contests. They don't understand it because for them, all nonprofits are unison. So they are taking a blanket approach to all nonprofit customers. And that is where we are, why we're witnessing sometimes blanket restrictions across the nonprofit sector. And again, they also do that in obedience to AML CFT frameworks, both global and national and global. Some of them mandate what I might call very strict KYC requirements, for instance. And it requires them to sometimes verify an address, requires them to get certain types of information and certain types of identity from. So that type of requirement has two pressures. It produces two pressures. The first pressure is on the nonprofit delivering the service. The second pressure is on the beneficiary. For many beneficiaries in sanctioned content, they've been sacked by their community. It's just like going to someone in a community that's been sacked by terrorists, everywhere has been set ablaze, bombed to the ground, and you say, for me to open a bank account, I need to come and verify your address. I need to come and I need to have your ID. Some of those things have been lost. So those people cannot produce those things. Another thing is it's not only in sanctioned context. What about informal communities? People who live in the slums. So for those people living in the slums, there is no address. Only the people who live in the slums know how to identify themselves. There is a woman living in the blue house, in the yellow house, in the round house, near the church or near the primary school. That's just all the identification they have. But when banks mandate certain requirements to open accounts, to maintain accounts, or to transact, so some of these things lead to. So we understand the perspective from the bank, but what we're saying is, how do we strike a balance between ensuring the integrity of the financial system, while at the same time ensuring that you do not deny people access to basic, essential banking services?
Right. So that actually leads me to my next question, Victoria. How actually can governments or regulators or even civil society, work together to ensure that AML CTF measures are actually effective without stifling activism and democratic participation?
Yeah, I will give you maybe two examples from the Nigerian context. One of the examples we have is we introduced last year what we call the tri-sector dialogue. Tri-sector dialogues has been happening in some other countries. And what that means was the first ever attempts for NPOs to begin to interface with financial institutions. And when we had that dialogue for the first time last year, February, it was most of the people in the bankers in the room were the head of compliance. And many of them were shocked to hear for the first time the impact of some of the measures, some of the refusals, some of the block transfers, some of the refused checks, some of the measures that they have put in place to ensure, for the treatment of for handling of certain transactions. They were shocked to hear about deaths it had cost, lives lost as a result of just one refusal to honor a transaction. And that prompted a consensus that was reached for us to see how to address these issues from a multi-sectoral perspective. It's not a campaign, it is not something that requires protest on the streets. It requires different sectors to come together and agree, this is hurting, this is hurting, this is not right, but how do we address them? So we started having conversation the banking compliance specialists, they have an umbrella called ACOBIN. So we started interfacing with ACOBIN, law enforcement, the charity regulator. We started having a conversation and we identified 14 pressure points. And what we are doing is to take the pressure points one after the other. It's not been easy, but one thing we agree is that there are certain things that are not working well, and we need to work together to address them. So that is one of those. But externally, a lot of things need to shift externally so that they can trickle down. Reviews, I've talked about the reviews happening upstairs. Probably, I don't know whether we need a special resolution to mandate countries. Once the FATF, they have revised their recommendation, there has to be a corresponding mechanism to make sure that they translate to reviews at the national level. Because it just happens upstream, and then we meet in India or in Vienna and we clap that some review has happened. But there is really no check back. Except, I think the only other way FATF intervenes is where there is maybe a mutual evaluation and they mark a country down. So mutual evaluations are not happening every year. So it means that if it happens, the country has to wait for another round of mutual evaluation before FATF gets the chance to review whatever problem it is. So there has to be like a specific, I don't know whether it's by way of resolution, but I know if they have had the power and the authority to develop these standards and everybody is following it, they will also have the power to mandate reviews at the national level. So that hasn't happened. Another concern from the civil society community is to make it mandatory, just like the UN resolution has made. For FATF has, and I haven't seen any of the standards that have mandated, apart from certain interpretative notes. When you put something in an interpretative note, it gives the impression it's a matter of interpretation or a matter of whether you like it or not. So in some of the reviews, to mandate countries to um, align their operations with some of the humanitarian carve-outs or comply with IHL measures. Make it mandatory in the body of the recommendation, not in the interpretative notes, not in the guidance notes. That has not happened. And we need more clarity on the implementation of risk-based approach. Like what I mean by clarity that we have different banks so that if you go to bank A and bank B and bank C and bank D, you are getting uniform response or clarity or predictability about what a risk-based approach means. Understanding that banks are treating customers according to the level of risk and not for their perception of risk and not based on the context or who's controlling the context where the MPO is operating. So these are some of the method. It's not going to be easy, but these are some of the recommendations that we've been pushing hard for.
Fantastic. So, Victoria, closing out on the session today before we move on to questions from the audience, if any. So, looking ahead, most of our audience is, consists of people from the compliance teams in reporting entities. So, going forward, what safeguards would you recommend, right? For them to strike a better balance between combating financial crime and protecting the legitimate NPOs or activists in whichever region they operate in.
Yeah, I think there are safeguards that have already been put in place. Let us start with those ones and obey them. For instance, we've talked about some of the UN special resolutions. Like an example is Resolution 264, is one of the historical steps we've seen towards protecting humanitarian operations while mitigating all the unintended consequences of UN sanctions. So what that means is that how do we also translate that resolution to legally enforceable guarantees at the domestic levels to ensure that humanitarian organizations can have aid access, can have their funds transferred, can carry out operations without restrictions and inhibitions, and also have legal clarity, provide legal clarity for financial institutions that are responsible for facilitating these transfers and also facilitating access to humanitarian aid. So let's start with that. That has not happened a lot. The second one, I already talked about the importance of financial institutions understanding that humanitarian assistance can be that lifeline or can be can almost inform the difference between life and death. And that emphasis needs to happen, especially among the FI, so that they can import certain elementary considerations of humanity in their compliance functions. And another thing is to ensure that this humanitarian aid access is not determined by the context. It is going to be determined by the people, by the beneficiaries, by the recipients of aid. What that simply means is that most times banks treat transactions based on who's controlling the territory. If a territory is classified as high risk, or if a territory is subject or under the control of certain elements, especially those that are subject to sanctions or under various UN sanction regimes, banks are usually very hesitant to deal with humanitarian groups or non-profits that are interfacing with those contexts or countries. So those sorts of things have to happen at the policy level and providing clarity, especially to FIs for financial institutions to increase their understanding of some of these domestic obligations of countries. But from the non-profit side, we are also giving ourselves a very hard knock that we also need to take steps to ensure that humanitarian assistance is be conducted by legitimate organizations. We need to take steps to prevent every form of abuse, every form of terrorism financing abuse. And for terrorism financing abuse, we are talking about the likelihood of terrorist groups taking advantage of nonprofit perpetrate their terrorist act. So we are organizing, like a Spaces for Change, we organize what we call the regulatory compliance clinics. What we do at those clinics is to share with nonprofit the various scenarios of terrorism financing abuse, show them the different ways that a nonprofit can be predisposed to terrorism financing and some of the characteristics that can predispose them to TF abuse. Whether it is by way of their internal governance, whether it is the kind of goodwill that they have, whether it is because they're operating in multiple countries, what structures do they need to have to make it even more difficult? So we're also sanitizing the sector to ensure that these measures do not disrupt the activities of legitimate charities.
Right. Fantastic. Victoria, thank you so much for spending this half an hour with us and sharing your thoughts. I think it's provided a very different perspective. Almost it's important for people to understand the other side of the coin as well. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, and we will request all the participants, if you'd like to connect with Victoria on LinkedIn, feel free to do that, and I'm sure she'll be happy to answer any more questions that you may have. But with that, let's close this chat today. Thank you so much, Victoria, for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Shirish, for having me.
Right. You have a good day, and I wish you all success in your mission.
And you too.
Right. Bye.